right? I think the core skill of futures thinking is really around the ability to have a meta level cognition. So what I mean by that is that you must have the ability to think about the way that you're thinking, which includes understanding your biases, understanding, the assumptions, the stories you tell yourself, you know, the oh, I'm not a creative person. Oh, I'm bad at, math, whatever. Like, I mean, it's like, oh, actually this is some story I told myself a lot. I'm an introvert, like, actually I don't like, so, and then to say, oh, actually, can I question some of these assumptions, which are the ones and to what degree are they true? Can I test the assumptions? And if I can, then what are some of the ways that we can also allow that again to create more space for us? Yeah. So on that note, futures is not necessarily just about long term, right? I think it's more about possibility and trying to create more possibility when we are faced with uncertainty. Yeah.
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to the My Working Title podcast, where we want to inspire and empower people to actively design our careers. Today we have Cheryl. Cheryl is our guest today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a quick intro of Cheryl so they have some context. So Cheryl's one of my favorite people in the world. She's super deep, super fun, super spiritual. We always love hanging out. So she is a highly respected futures thinking strategist. She's currently running her practice called 10 Futures. She is a senior director of insights and strategy at the Majority Trust. And she used to be a program director for Executive Education Singapore Futures and established the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Futures Training, and consulting practice, and more. So there's a lot of futures there. So, Cheryl, would you like to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks so much for having me. Really delighted to come and have this chat today. Maybe I'll start with sharing a little bit about futures thinking, and then we can go from there. So I specialize in a field called futures thinking. Sometimes I use the term strategic foresight instead, just to talk about the link between strategy and futures thinking. But broadly, it's a field of work which tries to help organizations look more long term into the future, and specifically how to deal with uncertainty in the kind of long term horizon. So usually it has a couple of components. It helps organizations think through some of their fundamental assumptions, that they use to think about a plan for the future. It usually has some components of thinking about what the horizon looks like, and what are upcoming trends, weak signals, that kind of thing. And so often it has I would say scenario development, right? Like what are multiple possible futures, kind of component. So it's a field that I got into because I used to work in government, and then for pretty much all of my career specialized in public policy. So specifically use these skill sets or toolkits to help governments think about the future long term. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the way to think about it is a contextual field, right? Like it helps us understand what is the context that we're going into and try to get a better handle, of how we should navigate these uncertain times.
Yeah, so I think we spoke a lot about also different futures thinking scenarios and all that, and how we can also apply in our personal lives. I think one of the things that we discussed was also like you with organizations, you work with them to articulate their core strategic dilemmas. You talk about the identity of the company as core values, and then we were just thinking, hey, is this also quite can be applied to our own personal lives and just curious, right? Just as a practitioner, you do that for organizations. Do you use some of these things for yourselves?
Yeah, I do actually. So, I think that's where it's quite an interesting meld of your professional skills and then kind of applying it to your personal life, right? But usually, when I run a workshop or a project with an organization, one of the things I kind of cheekily will say is that futures thinking can be quite a good organizational anxiety coping mechanism, right? And what I mean by that is that in many cases, organizations, like if you imagine the time during COVID, we kind of go into a very uncertain or uncertain future, and basically it's chaos and panic, right? It's very difficult to kind of discern and really figure out, how to navigate this uncertainty. So, I remember a time many years ago when I was like much earlier in the futures space, but I mean, running workshops for a long time and all that. I was kind of facing, as many of us do, a little bit of a career crossroads, and kind of thinking through the next step in a particular role. Um, and I remember thinking, I mean, the core question, right, is, basically, do I stay or do I go, right? Do I move on? What's that future look like for me? So I remember sitting in a cafe and doing an exercise which I would do with organizations. And this exercise is quite simple. It's called the data scenario archetypes. Basically it says that there are archetypal stories of the future that we tend to tell ourselves, and they roughly fall into four buckets. So the first one is a growth scenario, right? And growth scenario, as you can imagine, is quite a heaven scenario. This is usually our strategic plan, right? It's our preferred scenario. This is where we want to go. It's very visionary. So that's growth. And then, of course, you can imagine the opposite of that, which is a collapse scenario, right? Which you can think of it. The previous one was the heaven scenario. Then this is your hell scenario. It's where things go terribly wrong, and in the many ways that they can go terribly wrong. Then the third archetype is what we call constrained or disciplined. So in this scenario, we think about it as, we can potentially move forward, but it's very difficult, right? It's a bit like one step forward, two steps back kind of environment, and try to map out like what are these key constraints in the obstacles in the environment that we are kind of like running through mud to try to get through, right? And then the last one is a transform scenario. So this is we pivot completely, our old business model, is completely disrupted, but we managed to successfully transform into a new thing, a fresh thing. So with these four archetypes, I remember sitting in this cafe with a marker and a piece of paper, just writing out, actually if these four scenarios were what might the next 5-10 years of my career would look like, then what would a growth scenario, a collapse scenario, constraint scenario, and a transform scenario look like? And I think to me, firstly, I think the mapping exercise and just getting it out of your head and onto a piece of paper in and of itself is already a really valuable exercise. But I think there were a number of other key learning points which were quite insightful for me. One of them was that actually, when I was looking at the collapse scenario, a lot of the collapse factors were actually not external factors, so it wasn't so much about kind of like the broader, I don't know, macro conditions, and things like that. But it was actually more around internal collapse, right? So like burnout, being so overwhelmed, and basically miserable at the role, and then what would that look like? So it was less of a, kind of external shock and something happening from the outside. It's just more about the lack of resilience inside, right? So that was a big learning point for me, because I think that told me that actually then my responsibility to myself is to build up that resilience, right? I think the second thing, which was quite insightful, was this idea of what a transform scenario could look like for my career. So at the time, while I was relatively early in my career, and definitely much earlier than now, still all my career I basically spent either in futures or in public policy. So that's probably the fields that's what my CV says, basically. And the fields that I'm probably the best known for. But I think for me, one big question was actually, even at that stage of life, and even now, I'm still pretty much in the first half of my career. And if that's the case, then how do I think about actually what a transform scenario could look like, right? Could I have a meaningful, successful career not doing futures work or public policy, right? Which was a bit of a scary thought at the time. But actually, once you kind of manage to face that possibility, it's quite liberating lah in a way, because then you're like, well, if that's the case, then there are, instead of tens of jobs I could do, there are probably hundreds and thousands of jobs I could do, right? So that's quite freeing. But anyway, that's a funny little story about my own personal scenarios, and trying to map this out and use these futures thinking skills for myself.
Yeah, thanks. I think that will be incredibly helpful for us right now. So we are at a space where, AI is like, just growing at such a rate. There's so much uncertainty also in the political side of things. And I really like what you said earlier in some of conversations, that futures thinking is not just future, but with a S, right? So it's about having different types of futures. So curious, like you've gone
Yep.
through that. I know your journey. You had done a lot of government work, and now your just the introduction sounds very portfolio driven, and also you've gone through different parts of your journey. So could you just help us unpack that a little bit more? Like how did your initial four archetypes played out? As the years went by.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the four archetypes and the practice of the scenario process, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, it's an anxiety coping mechanism, lah. So whether you're dealing with an organizational level strategy or even just like for yourself as a person, the sometimes the choices can feel very overwhelming, and then you kind of don't make the choice until you are at a crisis point, right? So I think one question that I kind of always have in the back of my mind is that can you make these transitions in a more kind and gentle way, as opposed to being forced by catastrophe to change, right? So I think for me, one big learning point was really to try to also map out, right? The four scenario archetypes, depending on which scenario you find yourself in or you feel like you're approaching, the way that you would make decisions and conduct yourself, the choices that are before you are all different, right? So in corporate language, you will say that these are scenario specific strategies, right? So the scenario specific strategies mean that, for example, if I find myself in approaching a burnout collapse kind of scenario, then, I would need to do things that are very different from if I found myself in a high growth, kind of utopian scenario, right? And so then the next thing I did after I mapped out my scenarios was actually to map out what are possible strategies for all, including a timeline on when I would resign and under what circumstances, right? So, if you're in a growth scenario and you could potentially stay in the role for a long time, right? And kind of be quite happy there for quite some time. And then your triggers for leaving might be very different from if you again were in a collapse scenario where you think you're facing burnout, in which case you might want to try to protect that quicker, right? And potentially move on quicker, to make sure that you're not in a situation where you face your own systems collapse and then it takes you a long time to kind of get back up on your feet, right? So I think that in terms of building out that, I would say resilience, but also just the mental internal space just to be able to, I would say more calmly evaluate, the situation that you're in, and then take smaller steps, to kind of figure out what that looks like. That works quite well. And then maybe just to pick up on your last point about the portfolio, I think because I've now become quite used to thinking in a scenario kind of specific way, I tend to have a very non-linear view towards what the future, and specifically my future holds. So because of that, as I've kind of progressed in my career, I've also discovered that actually for a single role to encompass all the weird and wonderful things I want to do in my life is quite hard to find, lah. Yeah. So then if that's the case, then okay, lah, then I design my own thing, my own like a weird and wonderful combination of things. And I've been lucky that that's worked out quite well. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting exercise.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I just want to pick up on the non-linear way of looking at things. I think there is a increasing need for that. We see that things are moving so fast. Retrenchments are happening at the senior level, at the junior level. We've got new jobs coming up. We've got old companies fading away. Businesses are looking at business planning half a year. Apparently, that's already very long, right? In one of our earlier conversations, we talk about future thinking as a mindset and approach to deal with non-linearity, right? And coupled with our needs of certainty, prevalent narrative that we need to make the right choices, especially for young people looking to you. What have you got to say about that? What are some of your thinking that you wrap around this topic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I don't know whether it's a Singaporean thing. I have a hypothesis that it's a very Singaporean thing. But we and I while I've mostly done my work with large organizations, I also do some futures work with young people. And there is this view that there is I'm going to say holy grail what your career needs to look like for you to be considered a successful person, right? Um, and there is almost like, I mean, this is both a strength and a weakness, but there is a laser sharp focus in this kind of goal orientation. But I do think that that actually limits the possibility of a very, very wide range of scenarios where you could be happy, find meaning, and be successful, both in traditional and non-traditional definitions of success, right? The story that's coming to mind as you phrased the question was many years ago I had a young person. So this was someone who was just about to go into university, right? My bachelor degree is in economics. So this young person came up to me after an event and basically wanted some career advice. And they basically said, "Oh, since you got an economics undergrad, he was very, very keen on doing a banking internship. But he was also just about to go into national service, and the time frame, honestly, would have been very short, right? So then, as as a kind of a maybe older, wiser person, I said, why don't you just take a break, right? So anyway, he was, so anxious about needing to get into this banking internship. He needed to do it in 4 weeks before he enlists, and it was like this whole thing. And that's why I said, actually, why did you want to go into banking, right? Like, why is this economics thing so important to you, and so on? And basically, it came out in the conversation that he thought he didn't do well in his exams, and he had wanted to be a doctor. And then I said, huh? It's like, how did you go from doctor to banking, right? Like, and I said, okay, why did you want to be a doctor? And they said, oh, well, I think the healthcare profession is very meaningful. I would really love to help people. And I was like, you think banking is the best way to do that? I'm not sure, So then it led us into this rabbit hole of like, actually, let's unpack, right? Firstly, you don't even have enough data to know what your exam results are. So that's the first thing, so you're making all these decisions based on your current level of anxiety about your results. But I think the second point is that, if you can expand your thinking around what is, if doctor is not the goal, but helping people is the goal, or even helping people within healthcare is the goal, then actually your possibilities open up a lot, right? Even in the health and economics intersection, that's the possibilities are also, super wide. And then I kind of nudged him into saying, like, if I think about my own internships when I was in university, what I had done was do things that I thought I wanted to do, and then through the internships realized that actually I didn't. So I did an interior design, internship. I worked in hospitality, And then managed to convince myself when I was done, I was like, actually, I'm not good at this job. Maybe I should rethink my life choices. But that turned out to be very valuable insight for me in the long term as well, right? So I think that linearity. I mean, I just remember just leaving that conversation with this young man and thinking to myself, if there was a gift I could give him, I would really hope that he could have a more expansive view to what his future looked like, right? He was so early in the conversation and in the process, and there are just so many, even just looking now, with the information you have right now, there are already so many different possibilities and so many interesting trajectories that you could go on and still keep the core of what you want to do. Um, we haven't even taken into account, the issues that we have potentially don't even know yet, right? Technology development that hasn't happened yet, medical advances, everything, So that to me was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that example and love how you talked about trying different things, prototyping different things, being as expensive and opening up possibilities. So not everybody gets to talk to you one on one. So I wonder if you have a little bit of a, I don't know, lack of a better word formula or lack of a better word frameworks or whatever to guide through the process, or even a mindset to be able to I think the question in my head right now is how do we open up possibilities for ourselves?
Yeah. I think that that's a great question. I ran a workshop a few weeks ago with a government agency, and as you can imagine, a lot of anxiety around kind of macroeconomic headwinds and what does the long term future kind of look like from a policy context. And there is a great desire to increase your predictive ability. So to basically want to be more and more certain, and what you can do to be more and more certain in an environment where fundamentally it's very difficult to have certainty. And I remember telling them, and I don't think they thought this was a satisfying answer, but I'm going to share with you what I shared with them. But basically, I said, actually, in that kind of environment, all the more you need to increase your capacity to tolerate or absorb shock, right? So back to my funny little scenarios for my own career. Um, so after doing that mapping exercise, it cleared my head enough that I could just keep calm and carry on. And truthfully, I ended up staying in that role for many more years, and actually was quite happy there. So that was quite interesting, as a reflection, right? It was also just a way of, like I said, calming and anxiety. I think the second thing, which made it very clear to me, was that actually the short run fretting, um, was generally pretty unproductive, but what was helpful was to have very clear trigger points in my mind, what are certain things that I need to do or not do. And then, when I see those things happening, then I can change, right? So that's fine. So that worked out very well. I think the third thing that worked really well, which is back to my point about increasing that absorptive capacity, was that after I wrote down my individual scenarios, like strategies or decision points that I needed to think about, I also wrote down a list of what I call robust under all scenarios strategies, right? And it now thinking about it, and even at the time, I remember being kind of, I'm going to say, underwhelmed at how simple they were, right? So, for example, one big one, and the first one on the list actually was on, I need to do yoga more regularly. That whatever it is, whatever the situation is, whether I'm in a super growth scenario and really busy and things are going really well, I'm gonna need, to be a bit more grounded. Yeah, because I travel a lot, it's tough on the body, But equally, if I in a collapse scenario where I'm burning out and I'm stressed out all the time and I'm miserable, some regular, physical practice is actually quite useful. So I remember having a list, 4 to 5 things, which were very, very simple, sleep properly, eat your vegetables, like do yoga. And that I think helped me build out what I call that absorptive capacity to say, okay, I can be open enough to what this weird and wonderful future might hold. I think the last thing which was really interesting was also that I think it came down to me to really also think about what that core is, yeah, of actually what's important to me in a career. And for like when I was sharing about this story about this young man, right? If the core, and of course, he's young, so he has time to figure that out. But if the core to him is something along the lines of like helping people, and helping people thrive in a physical, kind of a physical way, um, I think that that's broadly defined enough to have a lot of um, uh, really interesting kind of pathways. Yeah, not just as a first job, but just or as a field of study, but also over a long career, right? Potentially 40 years or even longer. So I think for me, the thing that came very clearly to me in the exercise was actually the core of what I want to do is um very simple, yeah. And it's basically I just want to do meaningful work with my friends. That's it. I mean, again, it sounds I hope it doesn't sound too flippant, lah. But again, if I look at yes, I specialize in public policy. Yes, I specialize in strategic foresight. But to me, those are means to an end, right? At the end of the day, it helps me do meaningful work with my friends, lah. Yeah. So, and then if I have that as a definition, then actually the playing field is potentially quite wide, right? Yeah. So I think it also let me go down, kind of weird and wonderful pathways and been quite open to just like different experiments. Yeah. And once in a while my worlds collide in a very beautiful way. So recently I moderated a panel for the cultural academies. They've got like a journal kind of piece that they do. So they do this publication of these articles. So anyway, I did a piece on the future of work actually for the arts, culture, heritage sector, and I'm a huge arts fan, as you would know. Huge consumer of the arts. I love to paint and all that kind of stuff. And kind of mashing up what I know about art, museums, galleries, and then futures work. Was actually a really fun mashup, right? And after moderating this panel, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, would I have been able to do this if I don't go to the museum regularly? I'm not sure lah. Yeah. So okay, it's this funny little uh side quest lah. That give life a lot of joy and meaning. So yeah, it's a fun thing to do.
Yeah, I just love hearing your energy of your playful energy and also the openness to be looking at what the intersections we can be, what the possibilities can be, and also and all these things really increase our capacity to absorb shock. Like we take play sometimes a little bit too flippantly, but all these things actually build up our capacity to absorb shock. And I think there'll be a lot more shocks coming the coming years. Things are moving so fast. And also about knowing your core. Just curious, just wanted to pick up on also what the core is. You talk about a lot of it about the values, the core, the directions and all that. How do you see that playing out also in your own lives or maybe in organizations and other people's lives?
The first thing that's coming to mind as you ask the question is that firstly, part of that absorptive capacity is that you need to give yourself space to figure that out, right? Which is potentially a harrowing process of also not just being the person that people told you should be, doctor, lawyer, whatever, and then try to figure that out for yourself, which can be a difficult process, right? So I'm not the one to say like, oh, it's easy, you should just know. But I do think that there's some wrestling there. So I think part of increasing that capacity to figure it out, which also includes time, right? So experimenting with different things to figure out what you want or don't want. I think we did have this conversation in the beginning of the podcast around like this linearity lah, right? So if you I'm not sure it's a gift if you know very clearly, exactly what you want to do, and you to the exclusion of all else, right? I think sometimes allowing yourself to be surprised, um, and try different things, and fail at different things is also important. This kind of beginner mindset is actually quite useful, in navigating this uncertain future. And I mean, it's just bringing to mind that if I think about when I hire for futures teams, so whether it's for a project or for a futures role, actually one of the things I'm always looking out for is somebody who's very comfortable in uncertainty, for one, but also very comfortable learning new things and being a beginner, and not being good at something, right? But also to have some confidence in us, in to be able to learn enough that you can engage with expertise. So my informal KPI is always like, can you have a good dinner party conversation with an expert, right? Like, you don't need to understand this field, but you need to be curious enough, to engage, to meet different people, to hear new ideas, to use that to reflect on your own thinking. I think the next thing I would say is, and the example that's coming to mind is a workshop that I ran quite a number of years ago with the Art Science Museum. Um, and this was during the beginning of COVID. So they had this, so we'd run a small futures exercise. And I think actually exactly the same tool that I shared about my own scenarios, I basically used that tool in the workshop. And the key learning point for me, and the key landing point in the conversation was around this idea that the root word of curator, so you think about a museum curator, the Latin actually reflects a phrase that talks about caretaking. So when they think about their role as a museum, especially a museum that is very dependent on tourism, that is very dependent on a physical space in the middle of a global pandemic, then revisiting what that core identity of the, not just the organization, right, and the role of the organization, but also the core identity of the profession and the field of expertise that you're in. I think it really resonated with them that at the end of the day, the act of curation is the act of taking care. So then once you redefine what is taking care, from a museum perspective, then, you blow the possibility space wide open, right? And I think they really successfully pivoted in many ways. They were very active through COVID with online, not only online programming, but also online like education programs, the teams like really, I would say double down lah, in a really beautiful way to really showcase, what are some of these really interesting examples. So that to me is goes back to that point, right? About actually when you think about what is that core, gaining some clarity on that, is actually not necessarily limiting, right? It can actually be something that gives you an anchor to blow the space wide open. And then actually you'll find that you could be pleasantly surprised in many different ways. Yeah.
Nice. So I'm just hearing that exploring, giving yourself space to explore what it means to you, what it means to other people. And also in this non-linear world, right? So I was just thinking to myself, yeah, I was talking to a friend who's in Lazada. I say, hey, who's your biggest competitor? Is it Amazon? She's like, no, it's TikTok Shop. And I was amused because, the way that we shop on Lazada or Shopee is very, very focused, right? I want to buy a backpack and you search for a backpack. But TikTok is really very networked. It's like you happen to follow somebody, this person happened to share about a laptop and how he or she uses it, and then, oh, click here to buy now. So it's a very complete different type of shopping experience. Which is also what I recall some of your pet peeves around futures, right? Like about like prediction formulas, like just not trading the short term for the long term. Yeah, so just wondering if you want to expand that a bit more because I know you are just like, we gotta figure out being more. How can we create more sandboxes for ourselves? Something like that. I don't know. So just
Yeah.
thought you could share some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I I did this for a group of educators. I was asked to give a talk once on future of jobs, and I remember telling them I will give the talk on the condition that you don't ask me to predict jobs. So yes, that is definitely a pet peeve. I mean, just because we don't know, right? And the ability to firstly admit, but also be comfortable with the fact that you don't know, and still be able to make decisions in that uncertainty is actually quite a critical skill set for the future. Um, I think a couple of ways that that potentially plays out. One is, of course, that experimentation that we've started to talk a little bit about and prototype, right? And in that example, figuring out what you want is as important as figuring out what you don't want. So sometimes what I find, so I mentioned earlier when we were chatting that when I was doing internships in college, I tended to do internships that were completely unrelated to the field of study I was actually in. And many of these internships were because I had, at some point in my young life, thought that I wanted to be a hotelier, right? I thought I wanted to be an interior designer and all this kind of stuff. So I said, I mean, why don't I just try, right? Like, see how we go. Um, and while I obviously didn't end up in those fields, and I didn't end up as a practicing economist either, I should say, but while I didn't end up in those fields, I think one thing that it really showed me was um, I could also be at peace with the path that I ended up taking, which I think is also important, right? So when I have a bad day at work, I don't generally, beat myself up about, oh, I should have become an interior designer because I'm very clear minded that actually I probably wouldn't have been a very good one, right? So it's it eases the suffering, so I think that's something to kind of think about, right? Because actually that experimentation also gives you a lot of clarity, about the kind of work that you potentially want to do, right? But you're also balancing that out with the other side of it, right? Which is that you also want to hold it lightly enough to create different opportunities for yourself and to also expand, into different spaces. Um, I was sharing with you about this cultural academy moderation panel that I ended up doing. And one thing which was very beautiful about the experience was that when I was preparing for the moderation, I went to go and call up a few friends who are all in the arts culture space. So they only know me from the arts culture space, right? So they work in batik, they do comms for the, big cultural institution, like, all sorts of different players, right, in the space. And then I was like, oh, I don't know whether you know that I do future, so I'm going to moderate this panel. Can you help me, right? And I remember thinking when I was doing this prep that, oh, I was so happy to have this, to be able to tap on a network that was just completely outside my professional field. Because again, it just gave so much richness to the conversation, which there is no way I would have been able to figure that out on my own, right? So I think that that's also another thing about we when we have a very high efficiency kind of mindset, we tend to cut off, all these, I'm going to call them side quests, and some focus is important, lah. But, I think you're trying to balance that with also a richness, and in an environment which is highly uncertain, that ability to chart a non-traditional path, I think is also quite crucial, right? Because you don't have a playbook, you're not depending on somebody else's job description to kind of hand down to you, and you can kind of try to make that work for yourself. It's both terrifying and liberating, lah. Yeah. But I think the last thing I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned was this idea of like a short game versus a long game. So because I work in futures, people tend to think I look, 10, 15 years out, that I'm very organized and have a, 10-year plan for my life, 20-year plan for my life, and so on. And one of the things that, especially when I managing the younger teams, right? So in roles where I've had a much heavier management kind of responsibility, then, you imagine a lot of my, young associates will come and ask me for career advice, right? And very often at that early stage, my advice to them is don't trade the short game for the long game. Mean that don't chase, another job because it gives you $200 more, in salary. Not that that's not important, but what you should be chasing is opportunity, growth, options, right? And the thing that can build up the most options for you is going to pay off in the much longer run. Because if you don't have options, then it becomes very difficult later on your I call it opportunity space, but your opportunity space or your possibility space narrows very quickly, So even for somebody like myself who is, now middle age, and quite I feel like I've been working very long. But actually I'm probably still in the first half of my career, right? Like and there's a long way more to go, So if you ask me when I started my career, would I be doing this? I've been working for about 20 years, 20 years out. I would not have been able to tell you there is no way I would have been able to predict this, right? And likewise, I would like to think that if I think another 20 years out, what I will end up doing in 20 years' time, there is no way I will be able to figure out and predict that going forward. So, allow yourself to be surprised by it, yeah, and then have the capacity to take advantage, right, of what that is, So yeah, I mean, I'm all for the weird and wonderful experiments, and doing once in a while, doing some of these side quests, and just seeing where it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl, for such a wonderful, expensive, not expensive and expensive, generative, rich conversation. Just really appreciate sharing all this. What's in my head, in to just summarize a little bit, is to like futures. I always wonder what futures is, right? But futures seems to be creating a lot of options and then the possibility and opportunities for yourself, and also having it as a way to regulate your nervous system, to be able to increase your adaptive capacity to really look at what's ahead and have some form of a structure or plan, but also holding it loosely. So it is a good discipline to be open, generating options so that we don't panic at the time where we need to panic, or there's no more choice. Yeah. So I really like that futuristic thinking in the futures thinking. Yeah. So as we end off, I just wanted to ask if there's any last burning thoughts that you want to share with our audience, so that you can rest and they can feel like, oh yes, I've got something even more.
Yeah, maybe one last thought, which maybe didn't come out so much in the conversation, but it's quite crucial to futures work, is the ability to question assumptions, right? So I think if I left everyone with, something to kind of think a little bit about, it would be that, right? I think the core skill of futures thinking is really around the ability to have a meta level cognition. So what I mean by that is that you must have the ability to think about the way that you're thinking, which includes understanding your biases, understanding, the assumptions, the stories you tell yourself, the oh, I'm not a creative person. Oh, I'm bad at, math, whatever. I mean, it's like, oh, actually this is something story I told myself a lot. I'm an introvert, actually I don't like, so, and then to say, oh, actually, can I question some of these assumptions, which are the ones and to what degree are they true? Can I test the assumptions? And if I can, then what are some of the ways that we can also allow that again to create more space for us? Yeah. So on that note, futures is not necessarily just about long term, right? I think it's more about possibility and trying to create more possibility when we are faced with uncertainty. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so beautifully said. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure what you shared will bless many, many, many people. So see you around, Cheryl. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been so fun.